The general classification is that there are different types of tools
Mm.
that have different capabilities. So just because it's an AI coding tool doesn't mean that it's all the same. It feels really great if you just drop the whole prompt in and it just works the first time. But also you're more likely to get errors. For a lot of non-technical people, like
Hmm.
there's always someone who's like, oh, I have this great app idea, right? But if I could just get someone to build it, I'd be a millionaire.
Is there any other consideration based on which like we separate our tools, or is it like pretty much startable in any tool?
You'll find that like the different tools have different strengths. If you're building a side project, I would recommend if you're non-technical, Lovable first.
Hmm.
If you're a bit more technical and you want a bit more control, probably Replit. And if you're building like just, you want to build quick prototypes or test some ideas, I think Bolt is probably the best tool for that.
And is there any reason that you particularly said let's not do the backend first, like just go with the mock data?
Changing the backend is a lot more complex than changing the
Hmm.
front end. So I recommend, again, sticking with the front end, using mock data until you get to the point where like you're happy, and
Yeah.
then you can add that backend integration.
There's a whole
Yeah.
blur of what everybody can do because it now looks very full stack, like how apps are very full stack. I think a builder's journey looks very full stack.
Knowing how to code or getting past the technical hurdle is just like one of like a dozen steps or like a
Mm.
dozen challenges that you have to figure out in order to get something to
Yeah.
actually work.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Founders Foyer with me, Aishwarya. This foyer is full of conversations. The space where creators, founders, and builders look for all the support and concepts to grow their ideas into products. AI prototyping has been a buzzword over the last many weeks. Social channels are so full of hacks, best practices, tips, and different ways to crack the coding AI agents. But wait, also with all of that comes endless loops of error spotting and debugging. So, what's it like to really go from an idea to prototype to an app and still managing to brace and escape the stucking phase? We've got Colin Matthews here today, a founder, author, and AI builder, to take us on this ride with all his experiments. Colin has been writing and teaching builders technical concepts, and particularly how to ship with AI, having trained more than 8K plus product folks in this space. Colin, so glad you're here with us today. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Let's get the first things first. You've been formerly a healthcare PM in a very different space to actually now building full stack web apps and writing, putting out content for developers and the rest of the builders. What got you into this AI train in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've been working in healthcare for the majority of my career, about 8, 9 years now in health tech.
Mm.
And the kind of background there was I was working on very technical topics or domains. So a lot of it was like health data exchange, working on like data systems, recommendation systems, kind of like large scale integrations and that kind of stuff. And so just kind of through that process, I was exposed to a lot of like technical ideas, a lot of technical concepts, building products at scale, all that kind of good stuff. The other thing is like during that time, that 8 years or so, I was also building products on my own on the side.
Mm.
So I built probably like 6 different SaaS apps by
Cool.
myself before there was AI coding. So I learned how to code and did that on my own. I had
Right.
one acquired back in 2021. So that one went
Wow.
relatively well, but the rest of them basically
Mm.
flopped. And so, yeah, when these tools came out and I saw like it was possible to build SaaS
Mm.
apps or, basically prototypes very quickly, like having done it myself the more painful way, it just kind of made sense that, I'd get on board. And then, yeah, once I figured out that like you don't need to be incredibly technical to get them working, then I thought it'd be a good idea to share that with others.
Yeah, that's actually quite a journey. And I like how you've been on the builder phase even before the whole AI wave caught, because it's like a proper, yeah, you started off with the phase where you build micro SaaS and then you move on to, let's say, a no code, and then now like a
Exactly.
like an AI phase, right? So it's good to like take the train at every stage and like see the whole curve. So that sounds very interesting. And
Yeah.
I completely agree with you too, because right now, as you said, the whole barrier to trying has definitely come down. So I think that's the super interesting part, because most of the fellow builders that I talk to as well on social media, they have this balance between a full-time job. They also like tinker around stuff, side projects, which used to be a pretty, I think, we thought it was a common thing like a couple of years ago, but now I think it's even more than what a common thing would be, because there's like more ways to try it. So it's nice to hear from another person as how this whole journey
Yeah.
came through.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a great way to start. Yeah, as I
Yeah.
mentioned, I did that for many, many years.
Right.
Built many, many products. Some worked, some
Mm.
didn't. And I think that's the important part is like,
Mm.
if anyone is listening and they're working on their first one and they're going to quit their job, you're probably going to fail like at least 4 or 5 times before something works. And this is common advice, but Yeah,
Yeah.
I would give it a couple of tries. You'll learn
Right.
like where you work well and kind of
Mm.
what your unique strengths are, and then where
Mm.
maybe you're not. So like for example, I am not the best developer. I'm like a junior engineer level, right? So there's technical challenges that like
Mm.
I avoid because I know that's not necessarily where my strength is. But I'm better at like for example like getting distribution or thinking about how I'm going to get customers or
Mm.
users. And so there's different pros and cons to different people's
Ah,
backgrounds.
wonderful. No, I'm so glad you mentioned that because it's also important to lean into strengths, but I think it's also nice to like touch upon the other concepts of it. And for me, what strikes out from your experience is also the fact that when you can simplify these technical concepts, like especially with writing and visualizing content, which I've definitely seen on your newsletters and how you put
Mhm.
out content, I think that's a great way to also learn how to talk with AI because a lot of it is actually being able to explain what is going on inside your head, especially if it's a very very base idea you're tinkering with. So I think
Yeah.
let's definitely touch more on that, but I think it's definitely playing to your favor from what I see.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Cool. So on this note, Colin, there's one thing that I want to get like a very first hand knowledge on, which is when we go to YouTube or when we go to most of these social channels, like I'm talking about, just basic tutorials on how to get started with AI. But most of those are like very simple examples. People say like couple of hours, couple of minutes, wow, done, great. So we also see how people are actually getting to try more of personal apps. But one thing that I see them doing is actually jumping into these AI coding editors directly and then typing some raw prompts and then like just getting started right there. So is that a
Right.
good start, you think? Or do you think there's some prepping or setting the ground level that's required before that? Just wanted to pick your brain because you've been
Yeah.
trying this for a while.
Yeah. So I definitely think if you're just kind of messing around, you can get started in the editor and that's fine. But
Mm,
if you're serious about building something that like is a something that you want to ship, like a real project, then
mm.
then I wouldn't really recommend that. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about like the different tools that exist, and then I'll talk a little bit about
Oh,
how,
absolutely.
how to use them well. So the general classification is that there are different types of tools
Mm,
that have different capabilities. So just because it's an AI coding tool doesn't mean that it's all the same, right? So for example, Replit is one of the more popular tools, and they support you running both a client, a server, and a database. So if you want to set up a database, Replit just gives you that for free, right?
mm.
Whereas with some of the other tools, I talk about Bolt for a second. Bolt by default does not have a database. There's no database integration. So if you want to store data, have users, all that kind of stuff, you have to integrate with another third party, Supabase, in order to get that. And sometimes like those integrations can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're non-technical, to debug and to manage. And so again,
Yeah.
it just depends on like what you're trying to accomplish and for
Mm,
whom, to decide on the tool to begin with. And so that's my first kind of recommendation is like
mm,
figure out what you're doing. Is this like a quick prototype? You just want to test an idea? Are you trying to
mm.
ship like a real product or like kind of a mini side project here? The user's going to be signing into, and then kind of align whatever tool you pick to your goal, right? So that you're picking the right
Right.
tool and you're not trying to like halfway through switch tools or like take out what you built and put it into another tool because that's pretty cumbersome to do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And also for me, what I hear is there are different classifications of app that you want to build, right? Because I think what we usually see when people record videos and share is typically like, hey, let's just go build this to-do list, or let's just go build this tracker, which is
Right.
kind of what you just need on the client. Because what you need is like just a good UI and some way of interacting, and you just probably need, like you said, something that hosts a server, which Bolt or Lovable or most of these tools would do, and that's why your front end is like all handled, and it's great to start with. But let's say you want to build out something that is going to have a lot of data or users signing in. What's your typical process like? And the reason I ask you the process is also, do the prompts actually need a little bit of AI tinkering? Or is it that you just go and start typing out whatever raw thoughts that come to your head? Like what kind
Mhm.
of structuring is needed well before you set out? Let's say you decide that you want to build a very serious project. So what's typically like your cycle? Where does it start? How does it go? Where does it end?
Sure.
Like happy to
Yeah.
like if you want to show it live as well, happy to like
Yeah, yeah, sure.
take it.
Give me 1 second here to
Sure.
share my screen and we'll go through a quick example. Uh, let's see
Yeah.
here. Perfect. Yeah, so we'll walk through a quick example
Hmm.
of building something. Maybe we'll do the same app in more than one tool because I actually haven't done that in a podcast before. So maybe that'll
Let's
that'll
try
be
it.
fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, what I originally had planned for us is to basically build out this PRD. So I have a PRD that
Mm.
I'd written. I don't never worked at Etsy, by the way, for anyone listening, but this is just kind of a mock PRD for
Right.
some tax tooling that Etsy sellers might want to use. So
Right.
let's just start with this. I'm just going to actually copy this whole PRD
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to paste it in here. Now this works for like really lightweight PRDs. It doesn't really work for if you have like a massive PRD, and also if your
Mm.
PRD doesn't specify, what you're actually building. Like if it's not specific to the user interface, then it's not
Right.
really going to help, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So I'm going to pass that in as some context, and then I'm going to give Bolt here a prompt that basically just helps it make a plan. So that's my first recommendation is rather than like saying like just go, the first thing you
Mm.
want is a plan. And so we'll
Mm.
go ahead and say make a plan. Actually, I'll type it out first, and then I'll kind of narrate afterwards.
Yeah. Sure. And to get this,
So
you can also like, let's say, use Claude or ChatGPT or some way of like structuring this, whatever we saw in the PRD, right? Like some way to also like structure this if you're just beginning with it.
yeah, exactly. There are a couple of kind of key concepts that you'll want to
Mm.
hit, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you can use some AI tool to help you with that.
Right. Makes sense.
All right, so what we have here
Mm.
is make a plan to build this PRD, start with the data model, then break it down into phases, don't write any code. So what I'm
I like that
asking
line.
Bolt to, yeah, what I'm asking Bolt to do here is obviously start with a plan, right? And this
Mm.
is like my number one recommendation is unless you have a specific plan in terms of the implementation, and I don't mean a PRD, I mean like how the code is going to be structured, what fonts and
Mm.
colors you're going to be using, like all that kind of stuff. It's better for Bolt to have that information, and you can just ask Bolt to basically provide it back to you the same way you'd ask like ChatGPT or something like that. The other thing I do is I start with a data model. So the reason why is
Mm.
that let's say you have like we'll go back to the task app example for a second. Let's say you have an app where you have like a to-do list and then it also has a calendar. And so you
Mm.
want two different views. One is like a task view and one is a calendar view, but it's
Mm.
referencing the same data, the underlying data.
Oh, right.
You want to try to get the data model first and then the
Mm.
views second. If you go the other way around, you do the views first and the data second, it's possible that Bolt is going to basically split up your data or whatever
Mm.
tool, and then it's basically not referencing the same list.
Right.
So start with the
Fair
data
enough.
model and then break it down into phases. This is another kind of best practice is to kind of go
Mm.
one step at a time towards the goal.
Mm.
It feels really great if you just drop the whole prompt in and it just works the first time. But also you're more likely to get errors and issues that way.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so this is the general recommendation is something like
Cool.
this.
Yeah. It's
Um,
so simple,
and
like just giving like three concrete steps for it to follow and then followed by a long passage.
yeah, exactly. And you'll see what it does is, well, I mean, specifically, it's not writing any code, right? So this is the first thing
Mm.
that's different from most tools is like when you are trying to use the tool, the first thing it's going to do is write code. But you can see what we have is it's starting with a data model, right? Based on my PRD. And then we have the
Right.
kind of breakdown of the phases. The weeks part is kind of irrelevant here, but that's fine.
Right.
The different phases here, and then any other considerations. And then I'll just say, please implement, and we should be able to get started.
Right.
And what we should
Yeah.
see is that it starts with some like outline, maybe the data
Mm.
model first, and then it'll ask me like, hey, can we keep going? And that's a kind of a nice experience as well because rather than
Mm.
it making assumptions and then changing things and stuff breaking, it asks me like, hey, I've implemented this step. Can I continue to the next step?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a smart move because often when you just jump into with raw prompts, it doesn't have this conversation with you. It just goes on to like dump everything and then says like, yeah, here's it.
Yeah, exactly. So we have kind of our first phase done,
Ah,
and you can
nice.
see it says the next steps would be to do this. Do you want to continue? So I'll just say continue, and
Mm.
that's all I have to do because it knows what the next steps are. And we can kind of just keep going this way. So obviously, if
Mm.
at some point in time there's like something that I want to change, I don't have to stick to the plan. I could change the plan as we go,
Right.
right?
Right.
But we should have kind of a nice visualization here in a second once it loads.
Yep.
And then we'll continue on from there. So we'll have the detailed transaction
Ah,
tables,
nice.
tax
Mm.
warnings, and so on. So we'll just keep going here for a little bit.
Right.
And yeah, so you can see like, I mean, one nice thing is I haven't gotten a single error yet.
It's
And
I see why also it's because like you're also like kind of structuring it at every step and then monitoring at every step. So that's a cool way to do it too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then yeah, it just generally like this process takes a little bit longer in terms of your time. Like it feels a
Mm.
little bit slower, but I mean for anyone listening who's tried to debug these problems, this is actually way faster than debugging. So yeah, maybe this will be the last one. So it's gonna add a date range and a
Mm.
CSV export. So we'll let it stop there. And
Yeah.
again, if I wanted to like organize the content, maybe I don't like the UI or something like that.
Right.
you can continue to use it the way you normally would.
Right. I have a quick side note here. So let's say you go and paste the whole plan that you have, and you said at some point in time, if you want to change the plan slightly, you can go and reprompt it. Do we also like, let's say, make that file and keep the file as a part of the code? Is that something that you would recommend where we add it so that it's always there? Like all we have to do is like keep referencing that. Is that something you would suggest?
Yeah, so one thing that I do, let's see if Bolt did it for us here.
Hmm. Yeah, that'll
Um,
be cool if Bolt had added it directly, right? Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't look like it did, but sometimes what I have it do is actually
Uh-huh.
write the PRD for us and then put it
Right.
in as a file.
Right.
So the nice part about that is that if you ever like leave and come back, Bolt
Mm.
doesn't necessarily maintain context very well, like over a long number of messages or a long number of time. You
Yeah.
can reference back to that PRD and
Yeah.
basically be like, where are we at in this
Mm.
implementation? It'll be like, oh, we've done, step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and next is step 6. So you can kind of like
Right.
refresh that context through having a file. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be such a cool thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Whoa, we have it
Um,
ready.
yeah, exactly. So we have our date kind of filters here, right? We have, and it actually changes because we have some underlying data that's being
Right.
used, right?
Right.
We have our total taxes, taxes by country, and then transaction details. Um,
Right.
yeah, so this is like an okay example. Obviously, like I
Mm.
didn't have any preferences in terms of the UI, so maybe this
Right.
isn't at all what I want from a UI perspective. That's
Mm.
where like, having a quick mock-up of what you want is also helpful. So you can even draw it out in like, I mean, you could use PowerPoint if you wanted to, but like whatever tool you
Mm.
like Balsamiq or Figma or whatever. And you
Right.
can provide that as an image as well. So let's say I had
Right.
like some very basic mock, then it would follow
Mm.
that as well. So you can get like more and more specific
Mm.
as you go along. And,
Mm.
and I think that's one of the key points is like the more specific you are, the
Mm.
better the tool will do. And that refers to like literally everything. Like, I was very specific at the beginning about starting with the data
Yeah.
model. And because of that, all of these things are using the same data, right?
Right.
All these various components, right?
Right.
If I was less specific, then there's a chance that it would, not use the same underlying data. And then when I
Mm.
change the date filter, like this doesn't actually update, right? So
Yeah.
being more specific is just always better.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I also see that, let's say, had we started with just a mock image without probably talking about the data model, I think that would have also probably made the UI a bit better. But then we would have ran into the same error loop where it doesn't know which data to pick in from for which section. And then it would look clean, but then it would keep like throwing up different numbers or errors as well.
Right.
So, yeah, I think the data model part is pretty cool because it lets you set the context right at the beginning and then keeps following that for every section.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So this I think
Yeah.
is a good example of like where I would use this as a PM
Mm-hmm.
is just testing an idea. So let's say like I work at Etsy and I want to check whether or not this tax tooling is a good idea. I
Mm-hmm.
can pretty quickly spin up a quick prototype of this and then like share that with customers, share that with internal teams, and see if anyone thinks like, yeah, this works, or maybe we should make some changes. And then for those changes, you can keep making like quick iterations
Mm.
in here, right? So it's
Yeah.
just a really quick way to test your ideas. And obviously, the nice part about it is it's actually functional. So for something like
Yeah.
this, rather than like a Figma report, I can actually like mess around with the dates. I can look at the exports, like I can mess around with the tool in
Mm-hmm.
a bit more detail than like with a Figma mockup. You
Right.
can't really like try the tool, right?
Yeah.
And again, this doesn't look anything like Etsy, but maybe we'll just throw in one prompt. Usually, what I would do here is I'd include a screenshot, but
Right.
maybe we'll just
Yeah.
try this. We'll say like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
can you make it look like Etsy?
Yeah. Let's see what context it takes from there. Yeah.
And then one other thing here I sometimes ask it to do is like, um, how would you do this? Don't write any code. And
I
again,
like
this
how,
is
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, no, I like how you said don't write any code. One way that I generally do it, like, very similar, is that I'll always say tell it to me in words, so that like it kind of understands that it has to say it and not like do it. This is like fun
Right.
to say don't code.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you just want it to be like, well, it does two things. One is it gives you a chance to change it. So
Mm.
let's say I didn't actually like this orange color. I want it to be something else.
Right.
If I had just said, can you make it look like Etsy? It would have
Mm.
made this decision without telling me.
Mm.
Right? And so I wouldn't be able to change it other than like later on, I'd be like, oh, I don't like that orange. But that just takes
Yeah.
so much longer, right? To keep
Yeah.
going back and forth that way.
Fair enough.
So that's one nice part. The other nice part is that you can see like, there's layout modifications in here, there's type changes, like there's a bunch of stuff
Mm.
that it's changing. So if there's something I don't want it to do, then I can say, no, actually don't do that.
Mm.
But anyway, so we got some font changes. I mean, overall the UI is very similar, but
Yeah.
some basic
But yeah,
changes here.
yeah. The point is clear that, like you said, like as you get very specific, I think it gets the context. And is this
Mhm.
also like very similar across tools, Colin, you think, where like let's say I put the same thing on Lovable, or I mean I follow the same procedure on a couple of other tools. You think it's sort of similar, or do you see like difference between different
Yeah.
tools?
No, so it's very similar. So for example, Lovable, they have a nice feature actually where you have the ability to send a message where it will not write any code. So you can turn on like chat mode.
Oh, oh
And so it's basically
nice.
the same thing, but
Yeah,
it's built into the product. So that's a
right.
great feature. And then for Replit, they have the agent and the assistant.
Mm,
And so the agent kind of like makes big changes, and the assistant is something that you can talk to make small changes, or if you just have
mm,
questions. And so
mm,
again, usually the workflow that I have for Replit is like I start with the agent, I put in like one big
mm.
thing, and then to make changes, I use the assistant and I make a bunch of small changes with the assistant, or I ask questions with the assistant, and then I go back to the agent for the next kind of like
Interesting.
massive change. Yeah, so it's very
Interesting.
similar workflows, just different, kind of like different ways that different tools have it set up, but very similar workflows.
Right. That's so cool. And again, a very noob question here because for folks who are listening to just get started with this whole setup, let's say like I have there's Vercel, there's VO, there's Bolt, there's Lovable. Uh, Apart from the fact that you talk about do I need a DB setup or do I not? Is there any other consideration based on which like we separate our tools, or is it like pretty much startable in any tool?
Yeah, I find you'll find that like the different tools have different strengths.
Hmm.
So for example, Lovable doesn't have a code editor,
Hmm.
which for some people is really great because the code is intimidating. Like they don't want to see it. For me
Right.
personally, like I like to see it because if there's issues, the issue is going to be in the code. Like that's what it's
Right.
doing,
Right.
right? And so like a good example of this is we have this file here called mock data,
Hmm.
and this is where the data is. So for some
Hmm.
reason, I was looking at this preview and there's like something off about the
Yes.
data that was
Hmm.
being displayed. I could just go look at this file and be like, oh, I see what the problem is. So again, like Lovable, doesn't
Hmm.
have the code editor. It is super user friendly, probably one of the more user friendly ones to get started. And their
Right.
integration with Supabase is, I think, the best out of the set. Bolt also has a Supabase integration, but it's not as good.
Hmm.
Bolt I find has the most like generally purpose one, I guess, in that like it does a good job at a lot of things, but
Nice.
it's not so great at its backend integrations. So I
Right.
use Bolt the most for like quick prototypes, like what we're doing here,
Hmm.
but not so much for building like an actual side project or production project.
Right.
And then yeah, Replit, as I mentioned, like has, client server database support. You can also make
Hmm.
Python apps, which is really
Hmm.
nice sometimes. I built a couple things like I built a MP4 to GIF converter. So it
Hmm.
processes the video
Ah,
file and
nice.
turns it into a GIF, the video, and that's all running on Python.
Hmm.
So it all just kind of depends on like what your goals are.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, if you're building a side project, I would recommend if you're non-technical, Lovable first.
Hmm.
If you're a bit more technical and you want a bit more control, probably Replit. And if you're building like just, you want to build quick prototypes or test some ideas, I think Bolt is probably the best tool for that. V0 is also really great for that. The thing with V0 is they have kind of like built-in styling that looks really good if you want it to look like that. But if you don't want it to not look like V0, then it's a little bit trickier to get it to not look like V0. So yeah,
Right. I think it's because they use like the Shatsian and it's like a very typical,
exactly.
set of components that they go with. Yeah.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
exactly.
Yeah. No, but I think it's great, Colin. Like it's a great breakdown of where to go for which kind of a tool. And also like considering the fact that most people like fall into one of these buckets, and especially let's say, you want to see something end to end. And I see a lot of people wanting to use APIs from, let's say, OpenAI or Claude. So for some of that, then it makes sense to go with Replit. Is that what I hear? Because let's say you have to define your environment variables and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think for API integrations, yeah. So basically, Replit's a great choice. Also keeps your integration secure, just in case folks don't know. Like if you do
Mm,
just the client side integration with an API, usually what
mm,
that means is you have to put your key in the client, and then if you like share that app around with people, then like the key is in that code there that someone could get access to. So it's a bit more secure to do it with Replit. And then there are
right.
also other tools. Like one thing that I teach in the course that I have is using tools like Zapier or Active Pieces or Make to handle
Mm,
your API integration. So rather than you having to like figure out how to integrate with OpenAI, you can just set up a workflow with, let's say, Zapier,
mm,
and it handles all the complexity for you. So like what some students do, for example, is like go get all of my calendar events for the next week and then summarize them all with, GPT-4 and then give
mm,
me back their response. And they can build that as just a nice quick flow.
Oh,
And then they
nice.
just
Okay.
call the flow from their app that they're
Right.
building, and then they get the response back, and they display the data. So that's one other like kind of tip there is you my overall suggestion is like just minimize complexity as much as you can. Use as many
Right.
tools as you can to like just keep it simple.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this also like from what you say, it's also like sometimes you should just be like willing to move from one tool to the other in case you think it's okay, let's say you build to a certain stage and you feel like, oh my God, like it's not moving on from here. So at that point in time, do you think it makes sense to scrap it and restart it from scratch? Or is it like good to export your code? What would you generally like suggest?
Yeah. So this is a little bit trickier, I think. You have to be a touch more technical to
Right.
navigate this space well. So what I do is I typically try to sync my code to GitHub. Again, like most of the tools
Hmm.
have support for that. If they don't, you can actually just export the files and then upload those files to GitHub. So it's
Hmm.
a more manual version of the same thing, but it basically gets the same result.
Yeah.
And then what I do is I use Cursor on my own computer and I continue from there. So I've done that a couple of times where like I'll start with let's say like Lovable or Bolt and I get something like pretty far along pretty quickly. But then in terms of refining it or like improving it, I'll bring it out to my own computer and use Cursor to do that. And the reason why again is like one is Cursor, I find Cursor is just better at making very like precise changes.
Right.
So where like Replit, if you ask it for something, that the agent is just gonna like change the whole app every single time you ask for something. Or like let's say it just has a wider scope of changes that it will make. With
Hmm.
Cursor, if you ask for a change, it's gonna be very precise in what it
Hmm.
does. And so I use it for that. And then also honestly, just because like sometimes I like to deploy with other tools than these ones. Again, like
Right.
I'm a bit more technical, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
my own like workflows, my own deployment
Correct.
tools, like all those
Correct.
types of things. And so I feel comfortable like taking the code
Right.
out and then still getting it online by myself. If you're not
Mm,
comfortable with that, then I wouldn't recommend that.
right.
I'd keep it in the tool. Yeah.
Right. No, fair enough. So it's more like if you like to get to very precise control and want to see more specifics change, then getting it to your local environment with Cursor makes sense. Otherwise, like
Yeah.
getting it out on if it's a full stack app that you just want to stay on the cloud, then it makes sense to just use one of those AI agentic code. But yeah, I think now that there's a fair sense of how to start and how to get to a certain stage, I would
Right.
love to get into this phase, which is one of my favorites, which is handling the errors because
Sure.
this is like literally even though no we get to define everything very specifically, you and I we've seen examples of how we run into the error loop and stuck part, right? So
Yeah.
on that, Colin, two things I'd love to know. One is, does it sometimes feel like you're explaining it so precisely and so clearly, but yet you run into these errors that something of the agent is causing the error? Like that's one scenario. And the other
Mhm.
one, has AI ever led you to any interesting finds, like where you started to where you ended? Is there like a, oh, like I didn't think of this kind of a moment that AI gave you? So both these directions, have you faced this in your
Sure.
past?
Yeah, so on the first one, like basically the agent creating errors, it happens all the time. I mean, it didn't happen to us so far, but it happens constantly. I literally
Lucky
just
us.
asked I asked Bolt to create an error for me and it did. So I can show you how I debug that if you want, but
Oh,
you can
yes,
see it.
absolutely.
I literally just said like, can you create some import errors for me?
Oh my God, I don't think anybody would have literally just done it this way.
So,
But it's
yeah.
fun.
But anyway, so now we have some errors, right? So we'll debug that. But the important
Right.
thing here to remember is that like at the end of the day, usually what happens here is that there's some error that it's made because it's lost context. Like it cannot
Mm,
just remember everything all the time.
yeah.
And so it's either like made a typo or it's lost context somewhere along the way.
Mm,
And this is where being very specific is helpful. And honestly, like you having some understanding about what's happening. And this is like an advantage to more technical folks, to be
mm,
clear. But so for the type of error that I asked it for, I said, can you create an import error? You can see that it's failing to import the data from here.
mm,
Does the file exist? So one thing that I already know I could do is I could say, tell Bolt like, hey, this is an import error. Can you fix this? And
mm,
even just that context of like me telling it what type of error it is more
mm.
likely to get to a good resolution. For most folks who aren't technical, what you can do is just basically copy the error and then say, we're going to do the same thing. Can you explain this to me?
Right.
And then don't write any code.
Right. Love
And
that.
again, yeah, we're just using the same strategy over and over again, right?
Yeah.
So rather than just clicking the button, and most
Right.
of the time I would recommend not clicking the button. You saw it like there's a
Right.
little like fix it for me button.
Yes. Yes.
This one here. I would
Yeah. Yeah.
recommend
Yeah.
not doing that because
Right.
there's a very little like there's no planning happening
Mm,
when you click the button. Like there's some prompt that I assume Bolt adds onto it, which is like try to fix this problem.
Right.
But
And it can
it's
go and mess with the rest of it as well, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So what we get here is it tells us what the error is. The other nice part about this is the more that you do this and you actually pay attention, the more that
Mm,
you'll learn about like the types of errors that can happen and just
right.
generally like how this works. So it's actually a learning opportunity for you as well. So it says
Absolutely.
we have this error. It's because this we're trying to import these things, but the actual file is located over here. This is
Mm,
why the error is happening. This is how you fix it. And then it says, do you want me to fix it? And I say,
mm.
yes, please fix.
Would screenshot also work when you paste? Like can you also like paste screenshots? Would that be a good call too?
Yeah, yeah. I personally usually paste the text just because
Mm.
usually the text refers to specific files. Like you can see it
Ah,
saying
right. Right.
it's the issue is here, and the error log can be pretty long.
Yeah.
So you want to try to paste it in, but you could take a screenshot as well as long
No,
as it
but
fits
that's a
on the
good
screen.
call. I think
Yeah, yeah.
you decide how do you want to do based on like what kind of an error it is.
Right. And then yeah, obviously we're back. So that was like a bit of a mock example, but
Yeah.
it fixed the errors I asked it to
Right.
create. But the strategy is the same, right? Which is
Right.
basically, this right here. Can you explain this to me? Don't write any code. You
Yeah.
get the plan on how to fix it, and then you say, yeah, can you fix it for me?
Yeah. So you basically go to a coding editor and say, don't write any code, but then like tell me what it is
Right.
and then proceed. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
And again, it's just because they run out of like it's almost you can think about it like memory. Like
Right.
they just can't keep track of everything. And the bigger your app gets, the
Mm,
harder this will be. It'll start making more mistakes. It'll start changing things that you didn't want it to
right.
change. And so
Right.
you just have to get more and more precise,
Right.
like
In
as
fact,
time goes on.
yeah, no, in fact, one great point you made here is say specifically what type of an error it is, right? So let's say down the line, as you kept saying, like once the project becomes bigger and bigger, does it make sense to also go ahead and say, like, of course, if I'm not too technical, I wouldn't know which file it is. But does it always make sense for me to always keep track of what files the code is creating and let's say start hinting at those file names to go fix it? And how do I do it if I'm not like super technical? Is there like a hack for me to keep
Yeah.
track of what's currently being built?
Yeah, I would recommend that. Again, like as the project gets bigger, I don't think you have to do it at the beginning, but like
Mm,
when it grows in size, then it's helpful to be more specific. And then in
mm,
terms of like if you're non-technical, how you do that, it's actually just the same thing. So when you want to make a change, you say like, I want to make this change. Which
right.
files would have to be updated in order for me to implement this?
Uh-huh.
Please explain it to me. Don't write any code. It's just the same thing every time.
Nice.
Um, and it feels, like I said, it feels a little bit worse because it takes an extra question, right? Like it's two messages for every change rather than one.
Mm,
But the flip side is that like I'm sure people have done this. You could spend like hours and hours trying to debug issues that it comes up with. So
yeah.
it's not so much that you get to like have this magical experience where everything works. It's just you get to pick between do you want the errors or do you want to
Yeah.
be a little bit more patient with each
Yeah.
message? It's one or the other, right?
Yeah, I know that's definitely a trade-off you want to make. And 9 out of 10 friends that I talk to who are on this journey of building out their ideas, all of them kind of tell me the same thing: is that wow, like this worked in one of those YouTube videos, but why the hell am I facing so many errors? And it's
Right.
all smooth for the first 5 to 6 steps, but the seventh, eighth step, it leads you to like the error loop, and you're forever stuck there. But I think it also like makes sense from what you say is to it's okay to let go of those credits or tokens or whatever it is, but at least you kind of avoid getting into that loop much quicker than ever with this technique.
Yeah. The other thing about the token consumption, I've seen people like mention this before, but
Hmm.
token consumption is about text produced, right? Like how
Right.
much text is being created. And if you think about it for a second, like the amount of text that it creates to write all the code that then produces an error, and then you click fix, and it writes a bunch more code that produces
Mm,
an error, versus the text that we just created to respond to the message. Like it's a lot less text to have the extra message than it is to have like all this code that gets written that, and doesn't end up being used.
right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Completely agree. And that's not something we usually think of, right? Because we think that when there's an extra message, we always think that, oh my God, like it's like dual times of like doing this. But I
Right.
think what gets missed also is because these code editors go and regenerate all the code from, once again, unless of course you go and specify and say only this file, unless you do
Right.
that, I think it keeps regenerating all the code. And yeah, fair enough that you keep losing those tokens. But very interesting. And are there like any other techniques that you would add to this, like apart from like literally like tutoring it in terms of like tell me and then go and do it? Are there like any other hacks, or do you think like this is just about it?
Yeah, I mean, the overall idea is just be very specific. Like maybe what
Mm.
we'll do is we'll try the same prompt in Lovable, like we'll build the same thing, just so I can show you a couple
Yeah,
things over there that,
yeah.
just to mix it up a little
Oh
bit.
yeah,
But
for sure. Because I think it's also the fact that we wouldn't see the code there, right? So it'll be pretty interesting to see if it runs into
yeah,
errors, how would it solve for?
yeah, exactly. So I'll take the exact same prompt, I'll just copy and
Uh huh.
paste it,
Right.
and we'll see how it does. So, as I mentioned before, I find Bolt is the most flexible or the most
Mm.
generally applicable tool. So I like it for quick prototypes. I actually use Lovable for building more like production applications. I pick basically between Lovable and Replit depending on what I'm trying to do.
Right.
But yeah, we won't be able to see into the code. So if there's problems, you'll see that like I'm actually going to struggle a bit more with some of the problems because I can't look at it and figure out like
Yeah.
how do I solve this problem?
Yeah.
I basically have to rely on Lovable to solve it for me. And sometimes that's great. Like when it works, it feels
Mm.
great. But again,
Mm.
when it doesn't work, it doesn't feel as great. You can see at
Yeah.
the beginning here, we basically get, it's almost the
Yeah.
exact same response, right? So we
Correct.
have our data
Correct.
model, we have our phases, considerations, and then I'll just say, please implement the first phase, and so on. So while it's working on that, I'll show you a couple of
Mm.
things in terms of being specific. So
Sure.
one is that you can actually select inside a Lovable
Oh,
specific UI elements that you
nice.
want to change.
Okay.
Um, so sorry, I'm going to tell it don't integrate with Supabase. Use local mock data. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we could select specific elements in here, and we can make changes. So you can change the styling, you
Oh,
can ask it
nice.
to make
This is so
changes, and so
cool.
on. Yeah, so the different tools have like different pros and
Mm.
cons, right? And so if you're being super specific, one way to do that without having to know what the files are is to
Mm.
use a tool like that one, where like you basically just pick it in the UI and say, make this change
Yeah.
for me. Again, like I would say Lovable is very user friendly because it hides all the code. And that works up until it doesn't work. And yeah, so
Yeah.
you'll get your, trade-offs there as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. I think it also really comes down to what kind of an app, as we spoke in the start of the call, what kind of an app you want to get through. Because if it's going to be like very data heavy and something that has like a lot of sample data, then I think it makes sense to be wanting to see that at every stage, because without that, you wouldn't know where is it picking from. But this looks so cool for the front end stuff that you want to like tinker around, and especially like good landing
Right.
pages, good client design. It makes more sense to control those things.
Yeah. And one interesting thing here. So what it did in the first phase is
Hmm.
it wrote like I'm gonna call it the backend. It's all the mock data and like
Right.
basically handling of the data for the UI. But you can see there's nothing that changed in the UI. So this
Yeah.
might be confusing to most folks that like nothing changed on the screen, but it actually did a
Right.
bunch of work. So again, this is
Right.
where it's important to have a little bit of an understanding of like what is it
Ah,
actually doing.
doing.
So yeah, I asked it to set up the data model, and that's basically what it did in the first step.
Right.
And then now it's writing all the files for the UI.
Right. And is there any reason that you particularly said let's not do the backend first? Like just go with the mock data?
Yeah, so changing the back end is a lot more complex than changing the
Mm.
front end. Like it
Mm.
just adds a bunch of complexity. And
Right.
so typically what I would recommend is to nail the front end first,
Right.
like and just use mock data on the front end
Mm.
and then integrate with some backend system afterwards.
Right.
And the reason for that is like, let's say I like this, but I want to add a column. So I want to add new data. For me to
Mm.
do that on the client is super easy. I just say like, can you add a column and add the mock data? Done.
Yeah.
For me to change on the database, I have to like do database migrations. I have to run commands. I have to like update other things in order for it to accurately pull the data and display it. So it's like probably like 5 times the amount of work to get the
Right.
same update done once I've
Mm.
integrated the backend. So I recommend again sticking with the front end, using mock data until you get to the point where like you're happy, and
Yeah.
then you can add that backend integration.
Nice. Okay. Makes
And you can
sense.
see obviously, I mean, our result here is looks very different visually,
Yeah.
right? But it's
Yeah.
not that different in terms of the content, right? So
Content. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's following the same purity, right? So it's tax reports, tax summary by country, recent transactions. Um, it is asking me what else I want to do. Let's say add
Mm.
a pie chart just to try to match, and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah, but Lovable is great for like that editing feature, as I mentioned. And
Right.
this the Studio-based integration, once you do want to add a backend, I find is much better
Super
than
helpful.
Bolt. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
It's interesting because it's the same. I mean, it's an integration with the same service, but then it's interesting how like one tool does it more well than the other. Like what's more
Right.
particular about Lovable that's great than Bolt for this?
It's just I think how the team at Lovable set up their Supabase integration.
Right.
like the work that they basically did in order to build that integration, it
Mm-hmm.
works much better.
Ah,
Lovable has like a, let's say, a better knowledge of Supabase than Bolt does.
right. Okay.
And so when you ask a question like, hey, can you set this up for me? It
Mm,
knows how to navigate Supabase on your behalf.
nice.
Whereas I find with Bolt, the same is true, but it just does, most of the time it doesn't work as well. That's
Right.
all.
Yeah,
So yeah,
I
anyway,
feel
we
you.
got our pie chart and so on. But
Nice. Okay.
as I mentioned, like unless you have like a specific design in mind, I actually find Bolt does a better job of like the
Yeah.
base design than Lovable. That's just my own personal preference, though. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe some people like this better, and that's up to them. That's fine.
No, that's I think it comes down to what each person would prefer through. But no, I hear you, especially with the DB setup, because as someone who was like very new and navigating with all of this, I used to struggle even before Bolt had like an integration with Supabase. I used to struggle copying the SQL code, going and creating a schema, a table there,
Yeah,
pasting it, running the policies, and it was like such a mess. But
right.
I hear what you see with Lovable. Like I think I've used Lovable, but I've not tried the Supabase integration. But it makes sense to actually want to try it now because you said like it just gets it. So I think in that
Yeah,
angle,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah. Give it a try. I think you'll be surprised. Like I've built, I would call it like a production application. It has real-time
mm-hmm,
updates.
mm-hmm.
So like as users interact with it, it changes stuff on the fly,
Oh,
like kind of like
nice,
Figma or something like that.
right.
And I did that all with Supabase and Lovable. So
Oh, cool.
yeah, that's a kind of like a more complex product, and it worked just fine.
Yeah, what does it do? Like, what's the app
Yeah.
about? Like,
Yeah. So I built like a present because I teach online, right? So I built a
right.
presentation application where basically
Huh?
I can have people collaborate on something with me at the same time while I'm teaching
Oh,
live.
cool, nice. Like
Yeah,
a
just because I wanted to
whiteboard, like
have,
a collaborative whiteboard
yeah,
of sorts. Nice.
yeah. I wanted to have something that was a bit more interactive. So I teach a lot about like, I do a lot of diagramming. I teach a lot about like API requests and stuff like that in one of my
Right.
courses. And so I built in like, I don't know if you're familiar with Postman, but I built in like
Yes.
an API request tool into the course. So people can make
Okay.
API requests live like as we're working up through the course. So just stuff like that.
That's so cool. Like,
Yeah.
would you mind showing it? Like, it's so
Yeah,
cool.
sure.
Like,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
that'd be so
Yeah, give
cool
me one
to
second here.
see. Yeah, it's fun. This is a definition of personal software, I would say, because it's like
Yeah,
something that's going to be very specific for people, and then instead of going and like tinkering around with Miro, FigJam, and all of that, you're like, no, you know what?
right.
I'm going to build it myself.
Yeah. So here, I'll share my screen once we have it up here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a website autolive.ai. I had
Okay.
intended to like build some Zoom integrations into it as well. We can talk a bit about that later on if you want. But
Yeah, for sure.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, so let's just take this presentation here, this API
Right.
one. So I have like, some basic slide stuff. You can see I have like Canvas slides, I have polls,
Yeah.
Q&As, and embeds. So it's a slide editor, similar to like,
Okay.
Google Slides or something like that. And then when I
So you can
click go
embed, you
live,
can bring in your slide deck from anywhere that you've built. Okay.
yeah, exactly. And then when I click go
Nice.
live, what I have is you can see like I can see the number of people connected. So right now
Okay.
it's zero. But if we scroll down, so we have like our different content, right?
Hmm.
But then we get our API clients. It's directly in the course, right?
Ah,
And
okay.
so I'll show you another cool thing about this is if I open it up in another tab,
Mm-hmm.
the other person who's watching or in the course, you can see now we're at one person, right?
Yeah.
They will follow me. So if I go to this one instead, and then we flip back over, they basically follow along with
Ah, this
me.
is so
So,
cool. Okay.
right? And it automatically flips their slide as well, right?
Nice.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I built this tool for myself just because like I wanted to have a presentation tool that fit my exact needs. And I'm teaching this topic, and so like it'd be cool to have these embedded API tools or like any other tool that I
Right.
want.
Right.
And so yeah, so I
This was
built
on
this.
Lovable, right? Like this was on
Yep.
Lovable and Supabase and using Postman calls.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this one built
Cool.
Lovable. I did end up using Cursor to kind of like fix
Ah,
some issues with this one. So
right.
I pulled it out
Right.
from Lovable, but yeah,
Right.
this is a good example of like I would consider this to be basically a production project, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. This is
Yeah.
so cool.
Um,
And like you said, once you have a pretty good hang of how do you handle the code, then you take it locally and then try to get like super specific with stuff. But this is like such a fine example of what you can do on a completely cloud AI coding agent such as Lovable. It's a good example.
yeah. So yeah, we have all my prior live events.
Right.
And then as I mentioned, I was gonna integrate it with Zoom so that
Hmm.
basically what it would do is it would clip my live sessions because my live sessions are like an hour and a half long. So
Okay.
it clip them all for me so I can post them on social media, like just
Ah,
specific
smart.
clips. And
Nice.
like, like the Q&A section and stuff like that. I was
Nice.
gonna do that. So I haven't quite finished that yet, but that's kind of up next.
Yeah, I think the other thing you can also like do is when you, I mean, depending on where you're doing your call, like if the whole session is over Zoom, then like you can pull in this app, like just post it on Zoom's list of apps, and you can like just
Right.
pull this from within Zoom, not needed for a screen share at all. And this is
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that folks would be able to see. Oh my God, like so many possibilities.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's a good example of like just something I built. I don't have any plans to monetize it or anything like that, right?
Mm,
It solves a problem for me as like
yeah,
te someone who wants to do teaching. Another good
yeah.
example is like I built a referral system recently.
Oh,
So I can
nice.
show. I mean, we're just kind of going through all the things I built now, but
Yeah, no, but
that's
that's
fine.
that's the fun part, right? Like I think
Yeah,
the more examples that you see, and the reason that I also want it to be super real is because I was saying is these YouTube videos or anything that people generally show about is a very short clip, and all folks
sure.
knows, oh my God, like I can just type something and something comes up, but the actual part of dealing with errors, dealing with all of these steps systematically is what we want to see. So yeah,
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So this is another one that I built. So this is
right,
referrals for my course. So basically, a
right.
student can sign up, and then they
Hmm.
get their own referral tracker. It gives them like link
Ah,
statistics on
nice.
views and all that kind of good stuff. This one I built entirely in Replit. It's actually running
Hmm.
on Replit's infrastructure right now.
Right,
So like I just set up the domain, but that was it.
right.
Everything was built in Replit. And
Right.
then I have another one here called Showcase. So this is pretty new, but I'm planning on basically collecting a bunch of AI prototypes that people build and like having like a showcase of all these different
Showcase,
prototypes.
like a
Yeah, exactly.
community, little community of sorts.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
great.
built this one in Bolt.
Okay,
And
nice.
and then I pulled it out of Bolt and then I set up the back end myself with
Oh,
Cursor.
okay.
So
And those
again, different.
animations and everything, Bolt was still able to pick
Yeah,
up, like when you said,
this is all from Bolt.
oh, that's nice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did you have to give some specific prompts for the animation, or was it like,
Sure. So I cheated a little bit. There's this website called 21st.dev. I don't know if you've
yeah,
seen this.
yes,
So they have like backgrounds, right? So you'll notice that like, we have the
yeah,
waves, this little thing
yeah.
here, the animated grid pattern. So yeah, a lot of them are
Lovely,
the same,
lovely. This
right?
is actually my recent find, and I've been loving that site for all the samples
Yeah,
that it's giving. Great, great,
yeah, exactly. So anyway, this one is more
fun
like
stuff.
just a marketing page, right?
Hmm.
But again, you can do a lot of different stuff
Yeah.
depending on what you're trying to do.
I think this is a range of things that you could do with AI stuff, right? Like right from a full stack app to what you did with complicated stuff in terms of following through with cursors and with slide
Yeah,
deck to even like a good landing page. And I love the fact that there's built-in components or built-in libraries that you can make use of. So a lot of this, I feel like a lot of this just simplifies the setup that people start with because often we just go to the little box and then we start typing and that's where we think all of the reference lies, but it's great to see it outside of the box. It's great to like
right.
pick from outside. Like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I think.
because you,
Oh,
yeah,
go
go on.
I was just gonna say, I think like a lot of the work actually happens outside of honestly
Uh,
the box, right? Like, so for the slide one, like I did a bunch of work deciding how I wanted that to work
hmm,
prior to me even starting to use Lovable, right?
right.
In that like this is the overall design that I had. This is like the different types of slides that I want. Like having an idea of what you're producing the same way like you normally do, but
Hmm.
like if you're building software, is a good idea. Just get that out ahead of time, and then you can follow that design. Otherwise, like the AI can just take you to some random place that you weren't planning on going, and then you get frustrated and so on. So yeah, it's a good idea to have like a vision of what you're trying to build.
Yeah, of course. And like I think it just pushes everybody to think like a PM. Now there I see like there's a whole
Yeah,
blur of what everybody can do because it now looks very full stack, like how apps are very full stack. I think a builder's journey looks very full stack where you don the hat of a product person and then you also need to know a little bit of code to be able to like segregate stuff
right.
and also like be a growth person, marketer who distributes
Yeah,
stuff. So yeah, yeah.
yeah, for sure. I agree. I guess actually one more thing to add on that one, which so for a lot of non-technical people, like
Hmm.
there's always someone who's like, "Oh, I have this great app idea," right? But if I could just get someone to build it, I'd be a millionaire. Um, so I think what you'll learn, or what you'll quickly find, is that like knowing how to code or getting past the technical hurdle is just like one of like a dozen steps or like a
Mm,
dozen challenges that you have to figure out in order to get something to
yeah,
actually work and have customers using it and it solves a real problem. And
yeah.
so like it's cool because yes, now you can build anything you want. But all of the things that were relevant before in terms of like product and distribution and marketing and sales and all that stuff, it's still relevant. It doesn't change at all. It's just that now you can kind of use this tool to make something quick, which is still great. But
Mm,
yeah, as I
yeah.
mentioned at the beginning, like I've built 6 SaaS apps and I had one work out of 6.
Mm.
So, it's not like a
Yeah.
guarantee that it's going to work.
Of course. And it's a good reality check too. And from your recent examples, so like the ones that you built before and the ones that you just did with AI, for me, what stands out also is just being comfortable doing it even before you think very grand dreams for it, which is like you want to go monetize, sell it.
Right.
All that is great. But I think the first step is even to start and to get to where that is. I think we have to like experiment a couple of times and like really fail with these tools and learn your
Yeah.
way out. So it's just as a matter of fact, just building some stuff which you don't aim to monetize, but still teaches you like a ton of things to
Right.
go about in your way. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's actually how I learned how to code is like
Right.
just building projects where like I didn't know how web development worked at all, so I built like a basic website, like a calculator, right?
Mm.
And then like the next project and the next project, the next project, and they just keep increasing the scope,
Yeah.
um, with the goal of eventually monetizing something. But like I did not try to monetize something for like the first many, many years, right? Of
Yeah.
just learning how to build stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, completely with you there. As someone on similar journey, I can like
Yeah.
totally understand that. And for most of them, right, who are listening to this, I'm pretty sure that they are either on the journey of thinking that, like how you said, oh my God, like I wish I had someone who just like builds this stuff for me. There's like a bunch of folks who are like, I am building this, but it's not kicking start. But yeah, I think it's just like trying to navigate this through. But I like how AI is at least like getting the speed process, the velocity of it a little bit
Yes.
higher than how it was earlier. So that is definitely like a promising start for most of us who are in it for a long time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my main suggestion here would be like build stuff that with AI and then
Mm,
go and talk to customers and see if they care at all about what you're building before trying to like build some really big complex thing or like
mm,
spending a ton of time trying to get everything to work perfectly. Like you
right.
literally don't have to have a login page. There's no reason to have one, right? Because just build some feature that you think is useful
Yeah.
and then go
Yeah.
see if anyone wants to use it. And if they don't want it, then like don't worry about the rest.
Yeah. I mean, even the DB stuff, right? Like just do it with
Yeah,
the mock data, like just do it with the data that can just be on the temporary storage. You don't have to like set up
exactly.
your super base stuff and just like, go about with just your browser stuff. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah. You got
Fair
it.
enough. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. On this thing, because you're also like trying to build a community or this sort of a little showcasey page of sorts.
Yeah.
One thing that's always been on my mind with AI being like the super useful coding agent is that now pretty much, of course, like there are differences between tools in terms of design, but if you notice, there's like all these AI built apps seem to have a very similar style to design. So, like while it is very hard to get the styling part right, it's also very common to see how most of these apps tend to have very similar look. So, what's your take on that? Like, is design
Sure.
going to be a very unique thing, or how do you envision this for the next couple of years, where SaaS apps is just going to be made more with AI?
Yeah, I think the reason why they all look the same is because they use a lot of the same component libraries. So you're mentioning before about like Shadcn UI, right?
Yeah.
A lot of them use, for whatever reason, I don't know why, Shadcn UI as the default. Shadcn UI is popular, but like I don't think
Hmm.
it's even the most popular, to be honest.
Hmm.
It's become more popular over the past like 2 years. But anyway, so yeah, when it comes to styling, like one easy solution to this is just tell it to use a different component library. Like just literally find a different, like use Google's Material UI, use like Daisy
Right.
UI. You like just pick a different component library and it will look different from the vast majority of AI generated apps
Hmm.
because they're all using the same component library, which is Shadowstone UI. The other thing is that if you have like a specific vision for the design, that is going to be more difficult to achieve. Like
Hmm.
it's just takes time. And I think sometimes that can be frustrating for folks, but getting like something to look exactly how you want
Hmm.
takes more time. And so you also have to have a very clear vision of what that is,
Hmm.
right? So you can't just say like I want it to look more like Netflix. I want it to look more like Netflix. You have to say like I
Yeah.
want the shadows on the buttons. I want like you have to be very precise about what you want.
Right. Very descriptive.
Otherwise, yeah, it's just gonna, I mean, it will do something, but it
Hmm.
might not be what you want. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I would overall like I guess the easy tip
Hmm.
is pick a different design system
Hmm.
to import rather than Shadcn UI if you want it to look different. And then from there, it's about making like clear decisions on how you want it to look and then implementing
Right.
those, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I don't know if it's also like going with these specific Compton libraries would have its own error states or own error loops that would come up in the future. That's
Mhm.
something that we definitely have to try and learn. But one common thing that I found, there are like certain defaults, like how you said, there are certain platforms and certain quirks for those platforms. I realized that when you use Vercels, V0, it defaults to Shadcn. If you
Yes.
use Bolt, it defaults to like a white component library, and then there's like
Yeah,
like very particular specifics that it takes. But yeah, I also feel that with going very specific asks can also lead you to errors one might never know. But yeah, I think it you've got to deal with it when you want like very specific stuff.
sure. Yeah, exactly. And it
Yeah.
is a bit of a balance or a trade-off because if you stick with the defaults, the
Mm,
tools will do a better job because they know
mm,
how to handle them, right? And if
yeah.
you pick some like very obscure component library that has like 5,000 downloads all the time and you try to use that, like the probability of it doing a good job is much lower, right?
Right.
So it's a bit of a trade-off, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. As we are towards the last section of this chat, Colin, which I really don't want to end because we're like talking some amazing stuff.
Yeah.
I have this one thing I would like to pick your brain on, which is now we're doing everything much more quickly, right? Which is like hours and days that we're talking about. And in weeks, we have a fully functional app. Uh, but all of this requires like continuous monitoring, literally babysitting with the code, with the components, with the design, and specifying what we want. Is there like also another parallel world in the next couple of months or years where AI would slightly take a longish time to do something, but comes back to you with more specific stuff? Like I've always been dreaming about this time where like all of these agent stuff that people talk about, where we kind of give it a task, it just comes back to us only for like certain specific decisions, but apart from that, all the controls are taken care of, and it takes enough time to get something done. Do you see
Right.
that range as well for AI coding as someone who's practicing this? I do see Devin do this to a certain
Yeah.
extent with code, but like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think Devin is the best example, right? Or maybe the most popular example right now of like that idea. I
Mm-hmm.
think the problem right now is that they the AI coding tools just aren't good enough. Like
Mm,
they're just not good enough to take on big tasks
mm.
and do a good job of implementing that task without unintentionally just breaking a bunch of other stuff. And so you can actually like if you go on, Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, and you just look at like people talking about Devin, that's I think the most common kind of refrain is that you have to give it very specific and small tasks for it to work well.
Mm,
And even at that point in time, it takes a long time to do even like kind of argue basic things. The
mm.
nice part, as you mentioned about the Devin workflow, is like you could kick something off and then you go work on something else, and then Devin
Yeah,
comes back with the code, and like if it worked, then that's basically like having a junior engineer who did that task for you, right?
yeah.
So I think to begin with, like yes, I do think there'll be more agent-based solutions, but I think
Mm,
that like the scope of what they'll be able to do is going to be very, very small, and they'll still require
right,
babysitting. And then
right.
maybe as models improve over time, there'll
Mm,
be a way to get it so that they can handle more complexity.
mm,
But the other kind of limiting factor here is that like coding is a combination of like mental models. A lot of it actually is mental models, right? So like
mm.
an engineer understanding how the system works and
That's
then
right.
making very precise changes to that system to enable some new behavior. And a lot of
Mm.
the work is thinking, it's not typing, right? And so
And
I
reasoning as
don't
well, right? Like this
exactly.
lot of,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And so I don't really know how that converts to like AI where people
yeah.
want to see it do something,
Mm,
right? And so it's like if an engineer takes half a day to implement a solution where like they spend 5 hours thinking about it and 1 hour typing, that's okay. Like no one has a problem with that, right? Whereas with like Devin, if it takes 5 hours to think and 1 hour to type, it's too slow. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting problem. I think like fundamentally it's going to just require better foundational models like from OpenAI
right,
or Anthropic or
right.
something like that. But I
Yeah.
actually don't know if we'll ever get to the point where
Mm,
um, AI is capable of being as like precise as a human
mm,
is, because really that precision comes from reasoning and those mental
yeah.
models of like understanding how that system works.
Yeah, I hear you. And I have been having very similar thoughts too, because every time you start thinking about, okay, like this is helping you do a lot of stuff now, but what's it really going to be like down the line? And
Mhm.
you're right with the whole timing part, because with AI, what really like surprises me is we're always in it for the quickness. We're always in it for like, yeah, like how quick can this be done?
Right.
But I also want to think about the other extreme where are we really okay with AI taking the time, like really coming back to us after a while and not really rushing through. I guess, yeah, like you were mentioning, it's definitely something that we have to wait and watch.
Right.
But a lot of it would definitely involve the human factor. A friend of mine who was actually like trying to tinker around with Devin told me very similar things about it behaving like a junior developer, but having to give it a lot of context to even get something right. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's where we are now. But it would be very interesting to see how turns take and tables turn over time.
Right, right. Yeah, I think one of the things that like I do think AI companies will do well is managing context. I think that's kind of like the next big problem to
Mm,
solve. So rather than trying to get like the best model possible, how
right.
do you get the right information into the model without someone having to do that task? And I think if
Mm,
that gets solved, honestly, that would be like a really big unlock
yeah.
for a lot of these tools to do a good job.
Yeah, like how now we kind of sit and fine tune it every minute. We kind of say that, "Hey, why did you do this? Can you go back to this? Can you like reference this?"
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so true because if that is being sorted, at least like it would half of the context, the token length would come, like to at
Right.
least halfway and not like what's happening now.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. Awesome, Colin. This was amazing. Thank you for being here. I love this conversation. Like super practical, and loved all the stuff that you're building and the way that you are showing for me and for the rest of them who'd be listening to this as well. It's I love the fact that it's just like very simple to start with. At least it's not like complicated, and it's definitely like not one of those YouTube videos where I say, okay, here's a tracker, here's a planner, and it's not
Right.
like super common examples. But I am so glad that you shared very concrete ways to get started. So thank you so much. And
Yeah.
for folks who are willing to reach out to you, where can they find you, and what's the best way to like get to you with questions?
Yeah, so probably LinkedIn to be honest. I post every once in a while on LinkedIn, but you can message me there. And then I do have a newsletter as well. So on
Yeah,
Substack
I'll
and
plug it in the show notes.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then finally I teach on Maven. So if you're interested in, a kind of like guided experience in getting started with this stuff, then you can check that out.
For sure. Yeah, I'll put the Maven link and the newsletter link. And for folks, the newsletter is super helpful. I'm one of the subscribers, so yeah, it's cool.
Awesome. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.